Welcome back to The Grind for a quick guide on the Paradox Node Knockdown and Ectopic Burn, as well as Quantum Power. So you want to knock the opponent down to build up your Paradox charges, but if you knock them down with a heavy attack after parrying and continue doing that, each parry is actually going to decrease your Paradox charges. So you have to knock them down in ways other than parrying, stunning them to throw a heavy attack. However, what makes this ramp up a little bit easier is the fact that they gain power very, very quickly. So you'll be able to get your ins by countering special attacks rather than having to parry. However, you still have to be able to knock the opponent down. So you can play this start very slowly, build up to your special one, throw that off to knock them down, or you can bring in champions that can chain on a heavy attack at the end of their combo, like Dr. Doom or even Wasp would be good for this because they can do knockdowns with their heavy attacks very easily. However, you can also just counter with a heavy attack with certain champions after the special attack of certain champions. Omega Red is a bit challenging to do that with. So champions like Dr. Doom are fantastic for this. You just have to remember that when you knock the opponent down with a special attack or a heavy attack, you're going to get one Paradox charge. And when you parry them, you're going to decrease your Paradox charges. So you want to make sure you don't go over 8. And if you keep on parrying several times, you can get it down. If you're going to go into like a special attack spam with Dr. Doom, that way you can parry several times to bring it down so that you can spam special attack several times without risking going all the way up to 9 charges, because at 9, as you probably know by now, the charges basically explode and deal damage to you. You do want to be careful because if you go low on your Paradox charges and do a parry and get below 3, they're going to get that rapid power gain again, and if you're not expecting it, it can catch you off guard, and you don't want to end up pushing them to a special 3, or even some champions, you don't want to end up pushing to a special 2 because it's just easier to deal with their special 1. So the champions that can get those easy knockdowns are definitely going to be the ones you want to ideally choose, or champions with long range heavy attacks that can counter special attacks more easily will also be very beneficial. The other thing to consider is that with the Paradox charges, the more you get, the more you'll power drain on your special attack. So when you throw a special attack, your special attack, the last hit, will drain the opponent's power based on how many Paradox charges you have. So this can be a very nice way to keep the pace of the fight going, and you can actually prevent the opponent from throwing any special attacks if you hold block, let them dash into you, then parry or reparry kind of thing to prevent them from throwing special attacks. You can just keep beating into them, and then when you throw your special attacks, you will be draining their power, but it'll also knock them down, so you'll end up getting more Paradox charges over time. So you'll have to throw in parries to decrease the number of Paradox charges you have so you don't go too high. You'll also want to remember that your buffs can be nullified by the opponent every so often, and they gain power when they nullify your buffs. So you'll want to keep that in mind. As you saw, I was trying to let him hit into my block so I could go unstoppable and counter, but the unstoppable buff was nullified. So you want to keep that in mind, and if you have a buff you want to trigger, you should dex first so that your dexterity buff is nullified, and then you can then trigger the buff that you want to trigger after that. The next fight on the path is against Mr. Sinister, and so you want to bring in a counter, obviously, for Mr. Sinister. I brought in Guardian, and Guardian is a good counter for Mr. Sinister. Anyone who doesn't crit will be good, or who can completely shut down healing will be good, like Warlock. Now, the thing that I ran into difficulties with in this fight is Mr. Sinister seemed to be playing quite passive for me, and that became a problem because I was then somewhat forced to use parries to kind of slow the fight down and, you know, keep Mr. Sinister from backing me into the corner. And then I was parrying away all my Paradox charges, and then he would go back into the state of having massive power gain. So I was having a really hard time keeping his power down and baiting out all his special attacks. And if you just keep dexing and dashing back and causing the dex to pop up, then he's going to keep nullifying that buff and turning it into power gain, and eventually get to 3 bars of power. And unfortunately, that is what ended up happening. And something for matches with power gain like this are champions that have taunt or taunt-like abilities. And Guardian does have a taunt on a special 1, but Mr. Sinister appears to be immune to that effect, which I didn't know or didn't consider going into this fight. So that's something to keep in mind. mind. Now, we did end up getting him to throw a special attack, but now we're trying to build up our paradox charges again. So we're kind of in a tough situation. And then, you know, eventually we end up having the situation where he gets close to 3 bars of power again, and then he ends up nullifying a dexterity, pushing him to 3 bars of power, and ends up killing me. So I just went in to finish off the fight with Immortal Abomination, and as you can see, every time you throw a special attack, we're going to see, I'm just mostly going to highlight some of the node interactions for the rest of the fight, but every time we end a special attack, the last hit power drains. So once you can get above those 3 paradox charges and get them maybe even over 5 or 6, then you're going to start to do a lot of power drain, and you can pretty much drain the opponent's power completely and avoid them from ever using special attacks. But you do have to get up in that rotation before you can really get that going. But because the paradox charges carry over from fight to fight, you really only need to do that process with each champion one time. And so if you can clear the whole lane with one champion, you only have to do it one time and then maintain your paradox charges over 3 throughout the remainder of the fights, which is not that difficult to do once you are above them in a good situation, as long as you can get to your special attacks to drain power, so you don't have to sit around baiting out special attacks like I was in that sticky situation against Mr. Sinister. But you can see there that last hit drained all of her power, and so if you can, you know, get into these rotations, hold block, prevent them from throwing a special attack, build yourself up to a special, then drain their power, you never really have to worry about them using their special attack. So this is, you know, not a too difficult of a node to deal with once you get built up, but those first few charges can be a little bit challenging with all that increased power gain that they get at the start until you have over 3 paradox charges. So that American Chavez fight was not that difficult with Immortal Abomination, and then going in again with Immortal Abomination against Strife, we're gonna again be doing the same things, trying to manage our paradox charges and then building up to a bar of power. And if we want him to throw a special attack, we can bait it out. Otherwise, we can simply, you know, do our special attack to drain the power. Now, I currently have 4 paradox charges now after parrying, so I can knock him down several times before I get into trouble. But what I was doing was I was trying to prevent him from throwing a special attack, building up to 2 bars of power, and then I was able to throw off my special attack. Even though we had 3 bars of power, we drained his power, and then we can kind of go back into that rotation, you know, letting him hit into our block so he doesn't throw a special attack, building up our power, and then throwing off special attacks to drain his power so that we can keep the fight going. And you can keep the pace of the fight going quite nicely because you don't have to worry about baiting out special attacks and dealing with passive AI. As long as you can get to 1 bar of power before they go over 3 bars of power, or even in that combo, if they get to 3 bars of power, that's fine. You can push them up in their power, throw off a special attack, and that last hit will drain their power, and then you can just go back in. And if you can keep your paradox charges around 7 to 8, and then, you know, knock them down, have it 7, knock them down, get them to 8, and then do a parry, push them into your next special attack, and then you can keep that cycle going and drain a significant amount of power with those special attacks. Now, Purgatory is one of the more annoying champions on this lane if you haven't gotten used to fighting her yet, but if you bring in a counter specifically for her, since the remainder of the path isn't that challenging, you can bring a champion specifically dedicated for Purgatory. I just used Dr. Doom because he was full health and I wanted to use him in a fight again, so I have him against Purgatory, which isn't necessarily the best counter because you can't incinerate Purgatory, so you lose out a lot of that damage off your special too. But Dr. Doom is a fairly decent option for this path because you get easy knockdowns with the heavy attack when they have a shock debuff on them, so you can more easily control your paradox charges. More so at the start of the fight is where you notice that more significantly. And one of the downsides to Dr. Doom is because the special attacks drain power, you can't keep them at that 2 to 3 power bar range, which allows you to steal more power with your special 1. So you end up kind of having a more shortened Doom cycle rotation when you do use him, but he's somewhat of a safer option, and he's just tried and true reliable if you're good using him. But let me know what your thoughts are, what champions you used, and I hope to see you in the next video.